Hey guys, it's Sherry Vegas here, and today in this little tutorial I'm going to cover what types of resin you should choose for which jobs. So I'm going to talk about three most common resins, which is epoxy resin, polyester resin and polyurethane resin. So I do have a little list of notes, just making sure that I don't actually forget any of the pros and cons of each resin. So the first resin up is epoxy, and epoxy is one of the most commonly used resins because it's the easiest resin to use for beginners. The great things about epoxy resins are that they are self-leveling, so as long as your board or whatever surface you're using is level, your epoxy will come out level. This is not the same as the other two, so generally this is why a lot of people will use an epoxy-based resin. They are great for artwork, you can make jewelry out of them, you can do coffee tables with them, you can do a lot of different surfaces with your epoxy-based resins. They either come in a 1:1 ratio or a 1:2 ratio, so they're pretty simple to mix, and you generally mix them by volume. You can also, with some brands, mix them by their weight, but generally for epoxy-based resins, it's best to mix them by volume. And by volume, I mean by milliliters. With your epoxy-based resins, you can generally mix a lot of different mediums into them. So you can mix acrylic paints into them, you can mix alcohol inks, you can mix normal inks, you can also mix pigments, and there are also pigments and colorants that are designed for the epoxy resin as well that many of the resin brands sell. So you can mix a wide variety into your epoxy resins. You also have a more forgiving with environmental factors, so if it's a little bit too hot or a little bit too cold, or you haven't mixed it exactly, generally your epoxy-based resins are a lot more forgiving. So now let's go on to the cons about using an epoxy-based resin. So one of the cons is they do take a while to set. So the good thing is you do get a little bit longer working time with an epoxy-based resin, so that's why they are great for art, because you do spend a lot more time when you're creating a piece of art than when you're just covering a surface as a clear coat. But they do take a minimum of 24 hours to set. It does depend on the temperature and where you're setting them, but most will take at least 24 hours to 48 hours for them to set, and some up to 72. So that is one of the cons of your epoxy-based resin, is that you have to be able to leave them there for a period of time while they're setting. Another con is it's not the strongest resin. So if you're using any sort of woodworking where you are going to have to cut the resin with power tools, or you need to buff back the resin using power tools, it's not the strongest and can generally overheat. So you have to do a few extra steps if you want to use power tools with them. So I would recommend using either your polyurethane or polyester if you wanted to use power tools. So if you're doing a woodworking where they pour the resin into like a crevice into the wood and then they buff it all back, probably your epoxy resin isn't amazing for that. So the second resin that I'm talking about today is your polyurethane resin. So your polyurethane resin is quite a strong resin, and it's pretty stronger than your epoxy-based resin. It cures really fast, so you can get some brands that can actually cure in 15 minutes. So you only have a few minutes to mix them, like probably a minute to mix the 15-minute one. So that's great if you're making jewelry and you want it to set fast. You can use them for any sort of arts or crafts project. They are strong, so you can use them with power tools. So if you are making like resin bangles, you can then use power tools to buff them back, and they're a lot stronger than an epoxy-based resin. They don't shrink too much, so if you are working with wood, it's also a good option because unlike your polyester resin, which does shrink, this one's a little bit better if you are working with wood. Now, your cons with working with your polyurethane resin is because it does set super fast. I don't recommend it for beginners because you'll probably end up having your resin set in your cup before you've even been able to pour it. It's really sensitive to moisture, so it is not good to mix in with any other colorants than what the manufacturer recommends. So you can't mix acrylic paints into it, you can't mix certain inks or dyes or anything like that into it. Because it just does not do well with moisture, and then those extra mediums might actually have moisture in them, so you can only use the recommended colorants that a brand recommends. Polyurethanes also have an incredibly short shelf life, so I only recommend, if you are using them, to only buy the exact amount that you need, because they do not last well for longer periods of time, unlike your epoxy resins, which you can have for a few months. Bubbles can be an issue with your polyurethane resin, so sometimes you have to get a special pressure pot to work with your polyurethane resins. And I don't recommend using blow torches on them because they can be a little bit, what's the word? They just don't work well with blow torches. And they are not self-leveling. So unless your surface is completely even, you will not get that nice little dome that your epoxy-based resins do. So these I do not recommend for artworks or tabletops because they do not self-level. And the last resin that I'm covering today is your polyester resin. So your polyester resin is probably your least popular out of the three because it is the hardest to use, and definitely not a beginner's resin. So the pros about your polyester resin is it can be used for arts and crafts perfectly fine. It's fine with power tools, so if you need to use any polishing compounds or any buffing, it's completely fine to use with that. It's crystal clear casting, so you won't get any yellowing. Really great for that, and it is stronger than an epoxy based resin. So some of the cons with your polyester resin are they are really difficult to work with. So unless you are above a beginner, I would not recommend using them because measuring is very tricky, and you actually need to work out your maths before you start mixing your resin, because it's not a 1-to-1 ratio or a 2-to-1 ratio with your polyester resins. So you actually need to work out the depth of how much resin you need, and then that's how you work out your calculations. So it can be quite hard working out how much part A to how much part B you actually need when you're making this resin. It's excellent for molds, not great if you're trying to cast over any woods because it does have a really high shrinkage rate. Unlike your epoxy and your polyurethane, this one shrinks the most. So sometimes it can shrink so much that it could actually peel off what you've tried to cast. It's also not self-leveling, so would not recommend it for arts or any tabletops because you have to have the exact, and it's just a lot better to use an epoxy resin if you're doing any artwork. So I would not recommend it for any art, and also the smell is quite strong, so you definitely need to have a full face mask and a really well ventilated area to work with this because it will stink out your whole workshop. Unlike your epoxy resins, which are designed for art, that generally are quite odorless, this has a really strong smell to it. So I hope this tutorial was really helpful for you guys working out what resins you should use for what projects. I've just covered the 3 most common resins that I get asked about a lot. There are a few other resins out there, but these are the 3 most common. So hopefully now you know which one you need to choose. If you like this video, make sure you give it a big thumbs up, as it really does help me out deciding on what content I should make for you guys. And if you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe because I post new tutorials about art all the time. Thanks guys!